Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for taking out time for yet another episode of Right Circle that's presented by Shree Cement and is done in association with Prabhakitan Foundation, Syahi, ITC Rajputana, Spagia Foundation, and Ehsaas Women of Jaipur. We have a very special book with us today, and more than that, the author that we are presenting before you today is one spunky lady. If you want to define what being feisty is, if you want to define what being focused and committed, attention to detail oriented, everything, and the passion. So it's a very rare combination. And with that, I'd like to welcome Shrayana Bhattacharya, who is trained as an economist from the U and Harvard. And I don't want to be an ageist, but I'd like to see more of her kind of people being in positions that she is in. And she's been working as a senior economist at the World Bank, and she's also done projects for Central Policy Research, various other institutions. Most importantly, the name of her book, I think probably that's what caught your attention, and you fell for the trap, which is fantastic. Desperately Seeking Shahrukh, India's Lonely Young Women and the Search for Intimacy and Independence, got published recently, and is still getting rave reviews and a lot of attention, not just from media, but also readers. And I'm sure the print run is well out of the first. Well, fantastic. That's really good to know. She's also been awarded with much coveted prizes. She's just got the J.K. Paper Author Award for Best Non-Fiction and the Scotch, is that how you pronounce it? Yeah. Okay. Prize for Best Public Policy Book at the 79th India Economic Forum in March 2022. So this is the latest that you can congratulate her for. She also won the Vicky Ladies Organization's Young Achiever Prize for Literature in 2022. We're just 3 months down here. Okay. That's great. And to moderate the session, we have, everybody knows Tamanna. She's also, why she's moderating is because I've always found her to stand her own, and she has been brave enough to start her own newspaper for children called The Pink Buzz. And I have seen her steadily chisel away at putting the whole thing together, get her licenses, get all the paperwork done through the government, which is quite onerous a task. She also has a background in molecular biology, my God. And has a keen interest in languages. She is very, very keenly involved, and she's very actively involved in doing a lot of things for kids. I still don't understand this attraction to children because I'm not one of those people. But yeah, she's very good with them. She's also worked as she's headed our production team for Women Up Summit at Syahi. And she's also been actively involved with the Mountain Echoes Literary Festival in Bhutan. And she's a copy editor and a lactation counselor who loves wearing mismatched socks. Okay, that's good. But with that, I'm going to leave it to Tamanna to carry the evening forward for us. And it's over to you, Shrayana and Tamanna. Please just keep your mobile phones on silent. And yes, listen, you've got two very spirited women here. I need to see some more energy. Come on. Anyway, well, I think you just have to lean in and give them your energies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Meeta. So, diving right in, Meeta runs a tight ship. So, my first question is about the title. So, we all know what the title is. It's Desperately Seeking Shahrukh Khan. So, what does Shahrukh Khan represent in the title, and how did you zero in on this?
Well, firstly, this is such a pleasure. Thank you so much, Meeta and the CIB team and everyone, and Tamanna, you as well. this book happened completely by accident. It was 2006. I had just finished my master's degree in economics at Delhi University, and I had learned economics the way they teach you traditionally in Delhi University. I knew how to run surveys. I was very excited about collecting data. I was trained in quantitative methods. And I started working, Tamanna, at that time for a feminist think tank set up by a woman called Devaki Jain, who's actually one of our pioneering feminist economists in India. And we were doing a survey on the wages and working conditions of women who work at home. So I don't know if many of you are aware of this, but 64% of women working in manufacturing in India work from the home. So the home is a principal productive workplace for most women in the country. And we were supposed to do a survey on, well, wages, working conditions. There was a standard questionnaire. I was very excited, in my early 20s, very foolish, very naive. And I was sent to a slum in Ahmedabad where women were making incense sticks and garments at home, earning about a quarter of minimum wage. This project was with SEVA, which is again one of the world's largest labor unions for women. And when I showed up and I had this questionnaire, I was super excited. I started asking my questions, and there's this completely bored look on the faces of the women who are supposed to answer these questions. And turned out they had themselves done this same survey for their own rights. They were unionizing, they were mobilizing. They really did not need some woman with a khadi kurta and kajal in her eyes from the outside to come in her 20s and ask them these questions. So they just thought it was tedious. So it was a very difficult process. And when you're young, you don't want people to be bored of you. I mean, now I'm very happy people are bored of me. I'm still wax eloquent. But at that time, I just felt extremely insecure. You're in the field. And so we decided to take a break. And in research methods, they teach you, use an icebreaker, you talk about something else. And so then I started asking these women the only few things, right, that people across classes, occupations, languages have in common in India is typically politics, cricket, and Bollywood. So I started asking these women, who's your favorite actor? And everywhere I went, from the slums of Ahmedabad to the forests of Jharkhand, with different research projects, I was in the villages of Uttar Pradesh. In very conservative communities, I found these women who were madly obsessed with Shah Rukh Khan. And when I started asking them, because I'm a big fan as well, and this happened between 2006 to around 2008, because these were a series of projects, and I described them in the book. When I asked them, why Shah Rukh and why do you like him, there was this common complaint that, well, our men are like Salman, but we would prefer Shah Rukh, right? Like that was the general, I think the gist of it. And the fascinating thing that happened, Tamanna, was, I could just be an elite English-speaking, fairly westernized woman, which I am, and just say, oh, this is just silly, it's Bollywood, just dismiss it. But actually, when I started to pay attention to, well, why do you like him? How do you watch him? Do you remember what was the first film you saw? I suddenly realized that actually they were no longer talking about Shah Rukh. They were talking about markets, because many of us tend to think that fandom for film is just some social activity, it's a hobby, right? But actually it's an economic activity, because for us to unambiguously follow the work of an artist requires access to media, requires free time, requires money, purchasing power. These are all metrics of the economy. These are things that economists study. And I realized that when I was talking to them about Shah Rukh, suddenly they wanted to talk about their economic life, how hard it was for them to earn money, to just watch something, like a song of his, how difficult it is for women to access public space. 6 out of 10 people in an Indian cinema hall are men. These are extremely masculine spaces, particularly spaces of leisure. And I realized actually when we were talking about Shah Rukh, we were never talking about him, we were talking about ourselves. We were talking about the men in our lives, how they failed us or they did not, when they supported us or when they did not. We were talking about markets, as I mentioned, purchasing power. We were talking about access to media. So it suddenly became this very unusual way to have a very easy, relaxed conversation with people with whom I may not have that much in common, right? It became language. Like, oh, let me tell you about Shah Rukh, and let me tell you about Shah Rukh. And it just changed the energy of the research process. And then I decided that I was onto something in this fit of madness and, confidence. And I decided I would follow this set of women in the book for nearly 10 to 12 years. So every year when Shah Rukh would have a release, we'd chat. We would never actually chat about his films, you'll see it. I mean, there'll be some conversation about the films, but it's more about their economic trajectories and their personal lives. And at the end of 15 years, because it's from 2006 to 2020, I follow these women, and that's what's in the book, it's their lives. You realize I ended up writing a fairly intimate portrait, which relies on data, but also qualitative work, and Shah Rukh Khan's films, to tell you what women's experiences of the Indian economy have been like post-liberalization. So I think to answer your question, it was an accident, and then I think on top of that I decided to then layer design. And Shah Rukh is not Shah Rukh. They're seeking freedom, they're seeking particularly economic freedom, romantic freedom, and they're seeking men, families, and a kind of masculinity that will be much more supportive of women's ambitions. So yeah.
So it's very interesting that, Shah Rukh Khan is on the cover, a bit of him is, but like she said, he represents so many things that women are seeking all over the world, and especially in India. Now, so my next question would be, how did you get these women who you followed for so many years to open up to you? Our society kind of encourages silence and encourages suffering silently, but there's so many intimate things that they've shared and emotional narratives. So how did you get them to open up to you?
Shah Rukh will do that. How many fans? Are there any Shah Rukh fans in the audience? Yeah. I can bet, and actually it's not even Shah Rukh. If I asked you about something you enjoy doing, it could be football, it could be cricket, it could be anything that gives you joy. We as human beings are wired to tell stories about ourselves. We want to be understood. We want to communicate. But I think often as social scientists, we do this really terrible thing often to people who are not of our own class background, which is we sort of only talk to them about poverty, deprivation, let me narrowly fit you into like a questionnaire and then, move on. I decided to lean in with questions that gave the people I was talking to pleasure. They just loved talking about it. They also loved talking about the fact that no one was marrying me, which is a different story. And it just created this sort of open space. And I think it'll happen now. If I pick anyone in this audience and I start talking to you about the things that really make you come alive, you will, because anytime you've listened to a concert, right, it's never about the concert, it's about where you were in your life when that concert was happening, how did you make the money to show up to the concert, which bus did you take to show up. It's all these stories, and I think that's what happened. And I think it's because Tamanna, I decided instead of just focusing on the traditional research metrics of deprivation, I would lead into talking to people about pleasure and fun. And I think it will still land up telling you about socioeconomic deprivations you can see in the book, but I think you come at it very differently.
Interesting. Now coming to you, so you've also talked about your experiences. She's mentioned some interesting experiences with dating and relationships, and even the good and the bad, and it takes courage to kind of put them on paper for strangers to read. So would you like to talk about any one person or anyone in particular?
No. It's all in the book. and there's some of them are from this state, so I'm going to tread very carefully. There's a lot about the Rajput community in the book, so for those who are interested, you should just read it. Good and bad. But what I wanted to actually say on this was about adding the personal in the book. There's a way typically non-fiction is written, and particularly in India, and it's interesting to me, I think it's changed a lot in the West, and certainly in like Francophone cultures it's very different, is that you write about someone else, and then it's this very large distance between this lady I'm writing about and myself, and I'm almost absent, right? Which is a bit odd, because I think what I love about fiction often is that often you know the narrator a bit, right? Because the narrator tells you a little bit. And in a country where there's so much social distance between us and so many of the people we are studying, they don't have the education and the power to study me, right? Like that is, we have to accept that this is the way the world works, sadly, right now. I really wanted to try, maybe it was my own class guilt, I'm not sure, but I just wanted to bridge the distance. And I thought the only way to do it and not other them was to actually be open about myself, which is, someone gave me this piece of advice who's a mentor of mine who said, only ask questions of other people that you'd be willing to answer yourself. And also, if you're going to write about other people's economic lives, personal lives, and they are trusting you with these stories, you have to show up in an equal way in the book, or else it's just this extremely unequal text. And yet, Tamanna, the tricky thing with that is the book is not about me. I want the reader to know me because obviously I'm the narrator of the book, so you should have a sense of who is sort of presenting these facts to you. And in a way, it is a travelogue, right, of mine, of meeting all these women. But the book is not about me, and it's a tightrope because you also don't want it to seem like self-indulgent, waffly, like, oh, this lady is just talking about herself. It's about someone else, but you want to situate yourself very clearly. And that's the reason why I did the personal stories. I'm not going to tell you about anyone, you just have to read the book to find out.
And everyone is going back with a copy of the book, so you'll get a chance to read it. So, coming to the book not being about just you or the people in it and the economics that you put into it and the data. So how long did it take for you to, because at the end of the book there are these annexures with a lot of tables which are very easy to understand, but I think difficult to swallow because the data shows dismally low employment rates among women in India and even in urban India. So how long did this take you to put together, and do you want to take us through some more statistics so that we kind of are on the same page?
So one of the things is when we started talking about Shahrukh, one of the biggest things that actually really surprised me, and this was true, the stories in the book bridge class divides. So they start with the women I met in these research projects who tend to be what we would call from the precariat, right, low-income communities. But I decided to also open it up to more middle class, upper class women, women like myself, and just open up, just trying to get a sense of like, do we have similar issues? What is the commonality, right? And actually one thing that really struck me is the economic struggles are just persistent across classes. So I don't know if any of you are aware of this, but India, and I get into this in the book, which is India is in the bottom 5 when it comes to women's economic freedoms in the world. We have had a drastically declining female employment rate from 2004 all the way up to 2017. It's stabilized a bit right now during the pandemic, but essentially women comprise 11% of the workforce in India, the paid workforce. It's not that women are not working, women are working at home, they are caring, cleaning, in childcare, all those activities, those are not acknowledged or rewarded, at least not through the government lens. But if you look at paid work, women's access to independent purchasing power is one of the lowest in India in the world, and that is a abysmal state. And in the book, I get into why this is happening, and this is something I heard all the women I interviewed constantly say. Like it comes up in funny ways, like, oh, I want to watch a Shahrukh film, my husband won't give me the money, I want to see this, but my brother won't come with me. You're always reliant on someone else, because in a way, you usually don't have a job or don't have a stream of income that is your own. Right now, in the top 10% of India, the richest 10%, only 6.5% of married women have a job. That's a number we should all, think about. And in the book, I walk you through this, like how is it that we've reached this stage? And Tamanna's right in the book, there's data from 1911 all the way up till now, and actually 1911 our female employment rates were higher than they are currently. And we don't hear a lot of political conversation around it. It's something actually development agencies, The Economist, the New York Times, even Indian publications, people have written about a lot. Even the finance minister mentions it in her speeches, but it's something I think we need more of a social movement around, right? Like actually communities getting worried about this. And so that comes up, and a couple of reasons that I'll just flag, and I don't want to get into too much detail because it's in the book. One of the things that's happening is, unlike a lot of other middle-income countries, so if you look at a Brazil, or you look at a China, or you look at an Indonesia, which have also grown around the same time India has grown, what we tend to see is when countries grow, women step out of the home and are working much more. India has gone in the exact opposite direction. So as we have grown, actually the female employment rate has reduced. And one of the reasons that sociologists talk about, and the data bears it out, is almost that as we become richer, families can purchase more conservative values. So there's this idea that the woman should be at home, should primarily be a mother, the script of the caregiver. And so the idea is, well, if we don't need two people to work, or if we don't need a woman's income, this is called the income effect, you just withdraw. So women will withdraw into childcare. There's a more hopeful reason, and there are other reasons. There are 5 families of reasons, and I explain them in the book. But the hopeful reason that I do want to flag is education. So because more women are studying, and they're studying for longer, they won't immediately join ad hoc jobs at a very young age. So they're studying for longer, and then they probably get married. And the one thing that should surprise none of the women here, and probably none of the men, is in India, motherhood and marriage are what just kick women out of the paid workforce constantly. We have, in economics, we call it a motherhood penalty. India has one of the highest motherhood penalties. And despite the fact that the recent government actually did try to amend the Maternity Benefit Act, it only actually applies to, say, 10% of the population, the working population, because most women work in, as I mentioned, home-based work, informal jobs. They are not covered by these laws, so it doesn't really protect them. So there's a set of very complex things that are going on, and at the same time, which is what's interesting in the labor market, is that men's position in the labor market has become really insecure. So it's this very strange dynamic where, and in fact through the stories in the book, you almost get the sense of this very wounded, insecure male who wants to keep perhaps the woman in a certain position to feel comfortable, to be, well, to say, well, if the world outside is still insecure, I can still feel secure in very traditional roles. And you see this coming up again and again, because it's not that, men's jobs are not stable, yet I will leave this, I think I'll end the question with just one statistic, which is of the top 10 fastest growing sectors in the country, women only have 19% of jobs in those sectors. So India has grown, the economy has grown largely for its men, job growth has accrued to men, employment gains have gone to men. Women, the country has not liberalized for women yet. And you see in the book, I think, through Shahrukh, I mean, it's just one example. It's an example of flexing your economic muscle. You learn how hard it is to do something as simple as just wanting to watch a film star. It's like the simplest transaction. It's so hard. When you read the book, that's the one thing that really surprises me, and it's completely tied to what's happening to the economy.
Correct. I think from my personal experience, so I'm working, I'm also a mother, and I'm married, and all these things kind of go simultaneously. They can, but sometimes we are made to feel guilty about the choices that we make, that, oh, you're leaving your kids behind and you want to do this. And often it's also women in the, in the society who are doing this. It's not just the men. But it happens. But a strong theme in the book is this, like we as women, without even realizing it, are always trying to look for validation from men in the society. Even if we don't want to, we think we're very independent. But somewhere, and all the characters in the book, and you've written about yourself also in situations where you've realized that I'm looking for validation, and you continue to do it even if you know it.
Yeah.
So a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard, right? I feel like so many of us, and this is not just in India, I think this is a global script. Women are socialized to believe that you have to be somewhat supplicant, and even if you are like empowered, there are roles that you can't. It's really hard to be a single woman in India. Let's start with that. Okay, if you want to decide that you want to walk out of the traditional roots of marriage, motherhood, all of that. Firstly, good luck finding a house. I live in one of the nicest neighborhoods in Delhi, and I can tell you how difficult it was to find a home. Good luck. Second, good luck feeling safe in that house. Law and order, public space are not meant. Our public spaces are not for women. Even right now, one of the stories, and this is a funny example of this, I used to do research outside Mannat, which is Shahrukh's house, which is this big tourist spot, okay? People go to Gateway of India and then they show up to Mannat. And what was fascinating to me is I heard there, repeatedly, there were cases of mob molestation against women. I mean, this is Bombay, which is supposed to be safe, and this was written about. One of the journalists actually went out and wrote a piece about it. So if you're not even safe, standing outside someone's house who's an actor where people show up, good luck trying to feel safe in a house and living on your own. So I think given that the economy and our society make it so hard for women to just be on your own, of course, number one, there's a kind of dependence which is almost a material dependence. And then anthropologists keep saying that material dependence then also there's an emotional layer to it, right? Like you want to extract love, because love, there's so much work now that shows that, the economy is money for men and love for women. Women do the job of love. You have to earn love. If you earn love, you will feel secure. If you earn love from your in-laws, you earn love from society, you earn love from a man. That is actually the source of your security. And it's really hard to walk away from that script. But having said that, one thing I will say, Tamanna, I think things are changing. And the stories in the book give you a sense of what's happening. There are so many women in the book who deviate from very traditional marital roles. Some are single within their marriage. There's a woman who is a fascinating character who I met from Chhattisgarh. She basically negotiates being single while she's married. So on paper, they will never separate, but they are essentially separated. And there's a way she does that. There are women who choose to be single. There are women who run away from their marriages and come back. So there's a lot of negotiation that's going on. I think that is only possible now because I think because of the media, the economy, things are changing. People are exposed to a lot more of what's going on. And yet, as you see, those are all very difficult struggles that these women have to put up with. And the book gives you a sense of what this involves, just wanting to find a house of your own. It's very difficult. But I think that's why I don't think it's validation. I actually don't think it's validation. I think it's a kind of support. It's partly material and partly emotional. All of us need it, men and women, everyone. But I think women are burdened with it because you cannot, without that support, love is currency to give you like some status and support that, okay, we will take care of you, right? When the economy and public space will not. And when the market will not, and the government certainly won't right now. So you will rely on your family, you will rely on your in-laws, men, boyfriends, lovers, all of that. And in fact, I think it's quite unfair because I almost feel like you're putting so much pressure on these relationships because you're not expecting a man to just love you for you. You're expecting him to take care of you. There's all these scripts of like a lot of dependence. The book, I think, gives you a sense of there are women who are playing around with that. They want to shift those norms. And it's hard to do, but somehow she ended up doing it.
So when I was reading this, I had called her up and said, hey, I think I know one of the girls that you mentioned, and her name is Gold, and then finally she explained to me that it wasn't the person that I thought she was. But it also kind of showed us that we will all be able to relate to the characters that she's talked about. So there's Zahira, there is Manju, there is Gold, and we'll all have a copy of the book after the session. So would you want to tell us a little bit more about the girl called Gold?
She's from the state, she's from Jaisalmer. She ran away from her home. Her family wanted her to get married to someone she really did not want to marry. She was a woman who, even as a kid in school, she was extremely proactive, had lots of admirers. She just wanted to go and taste the world. I think Jaisalmer was never going to be enough for her. She wanted to be out and about. She wanted to go to London, right? Like she saw Shah Rukh in that DDLJ song in that metro and she said, I want to see him. I want to be in London on that spot. But using that as an example, but it did stir something in her. And she decides to run away. She ends up becoming an in-flight attendant, and there's a very complex set of ways through which she gets the training, finds the job. You'll hear the story, you'll read the story in the book, hopefully. And what's fascinating about her is that then she moves to Gurgaon, which is her airline hub. And she's living with other women who are in the same aviation business as her. And we should remember the only reason she can do this is because in the 1990s, the economy opened up and these jobs were created, right? Like the economy, so this is what I mean, like I think the economy, we don't realize that the economy sets up the framework for our personal lives so much. So she could do this because suddenly there were jobs that were satellite jobs. She trained, there were new, like, these in-flight aviation academies where they train you on how to take on these jobs. She did this, went off to Gurgaon and then tries to find, a husband on her own because she wants to marry, she wants to be in that kind of, she really aspires for that. And it's really heartbreaking because you realize in the book, it's such a brutal mating market. It's a man's market because she says to me, and I'm quoting her in the book, she says, each time I go on a date with a man, I feel like I'm not just with him, but I'm with all the other women he could potentially be like dating at the same time, because it is okay for men to explore multiple options, but for women it is not. There are biological reasons it's not, because it's unsafe, there's sexual hygiene concerns. There's some very scary stories about abortion in there. And there's socially it's not sanctioned as well. There's a lot of discomfort around it. And I think given that, she's now suddenly, and she said to me, she said, family is like the police, because if a boy treated you badly and you were introduced to him through the family, the family would intervene. Now she's run away from that. She's run away from the protections of her family because she wants freedom in Gurgaon. And now she says, well, I wanted freedom, but freedom is really costly. It's very hard, and she has some extremely lonely days where then she watches this Shah Rukh documentary to feel. The reason I know about this is because we were talking about a Shah Rukh documentary that she liked, so we have to inform him, right, just out of courtesy because the name is in the title. They've only been kind and generous, and inshallah, given the rate at which everybody seems to be sending messages to his team about the book, and the book's now, doing well, hopefully next time, yeah. I thought what I'd do is I want to read from someone I love every woman I followed in the book, but this one I think is very special to me. She's a government accountant. She joined the Delhi State Cadre, and she's the accounting cadre, and it's a really difficult job. I think all of us know getting into government jobs is very hard. She's from Delhi, and when I asked her, what do you want to call yourself for the book, she said, call me the accountant, because she was so proud of being a good accountant. Like, she really, that gave her a lot of meaning. And I want to read to you a little bit about how she's preparing for these exams, the government exams, and what her family is making her do while the government exams are happening. The section's called Om Shanti Om. It's named after one of Shah Rukh's most heartwarming films. Please watch it if you haven't. Between 2006 and 2009, the accountant had spent 3 arduous years preparing for 3 government entrance exams. What made matters worse were the marriage exams she was forced to endure. During those days, every Shah Rukh interview or film release became a seasonal time of healing, a psychological break from the general nuisance of her immediate society. A place where she could forget the taunts from her cousins, aunts, parents and friends about how her government exam scouting and studies were merely a part-time effort while she concentrated full-time on matrimony. A place where no one could find her, a place where she could ignore the fact that her male cousins never faced the same level of scrutiny in marriage or at work. A place where there was no record keeping, no score to settle, a place where she could never be asked to account. On tough days, and there were many, she would cry into her scrapbook. An endless loop of tears and tests constituted a significant part of her late 20s. I'm quoting her, she says, "Even after I got such a good job, people never allowed me to enjoy it fully. Everyone was only interested in when I was getting married." After joining the Delhi Secretariat in early 2009, she found herself in a peculiar place in the marriage market. Her job had all the status, stability, and prospects of a lower-grade government officer. She planned to compete for the position of Assistant Accounts Officer within the government, exclusively open to internal candidates through exams, and move upwards. Her current subordinate service job, though prestigious to an ordinary Indian, was not as high-ranking or well-paying as the elite IAS or the Delhi Andaman and Nicobar Islands services. These are the DANIC services that work in Delhi. Thanks to the private sector boom at the time, all her prospective grooms, through arranged marriage proposals, earned significantly more money than she did. As a result, in all her interactions with matchmakers and interested families, she was always expected to give up her job, despite its stability and relative privilege. After they check, and I'm quoting her, she says, "After they check on our plans to work outside the home, the accountant would tell me about the questions posed by prospective in-laws. They always ask us how well we can cook. One of my friends was asked if she could make continental cuisine, as the boy was very fond of foreign food. She was worried that no other proposal would come for her and decided to train so that she could get married. Her 12 years of marriage have been spent being a cook and cleaner. She loves her children, but she says she would leave him if she had a place to go and if she could support her kids on her own." Everything the accountant said about marriage was in the form of a cautionary tale. Another story. "I have a friend from college, she once told me, a girl like you, English speaking from a good school. She married a man from IIM Bangalore and moved to London. She says that her husband barely talks to her other than telling her what he wants for dinner. Can you imagine a world in which we refuse to marry men who can't cook for themselves? If we asked the boy's family if he could cook, if men were tested as much as women are, very few people would get married, or maybe boys would learn to take care of themselves. It's happening with the IT programmers from the south. My friend says those boys are better able to cook and clean as they have lived on their own in other countries. But those stories are rare, and who let a Bania girl marry a boy from the south anyway? Who let us move south?"
you. So a lot of things for us to think about for the men and for the women, guys. Please speak to younger people that you know about this, about the book, about the message that it carries. And now we'd like to open the floor to audience questions.
Hey, hi, I'm Durva Sharma. My question is that in India, we see there is a disparity between the amount of the salary that is paid to the men than women. Even Bollywood starlets like Deepika Padukone and Priyanka Chopra, they say we are not paid as much. So why is it so? Is it because financial independence and more of it gives an independence to the woman? Because she is liberated, she can take her own decisions, क्योंकि वो ज़्यादा कमा रही है, तो घर में भी ये सुनने को मिलता है कि 2-4 पैसे क्या कमाने लग गए, बहुत दिमाग आ गया. तो is it because of that the society wants to suppress women? No, you cannot go further. इससे ज़्यादा अधिक जाओगे तुम्हारा दिमाग खराब हो जाएगा. So do you think that is the major reason, or is there any other?
So thanks, Durga. That's a great question. Should I just answer? Yeah. I think a couple of things are going on. One is, if I were to just be a technical economist, it's the motherhood penalty. It is a fact in any job, and it's very unfortunate. It's not, I don't want to paint. I think often when we have this conversation on gender, we tend to say, oh, society is bad, and hum sab itne achhe hain. But we are all society, right? And I think what's interesting is, and I'm trying to sort of explain this, so for example, the private sector has tried. There are lots of efforts that companies have made. There's a story of some of the women in the book that companies actually want them to come back. But it's a very complex negotiation. I'm not a mother, but I have very dear friends who are, and I have seen that it's very difficult to want to leave a baby immediately. There are decisions that you want to make, right? And I don't want to judge people for making those decisions. So I think one is, there's motherhood. There is the tyranny of the body and the fact that women carry children, and that has implications on wage rates, hours of work, productivity. It is unfortunate, but that is the case, and these are trade-offs that women are making. I think what would help is if men participated more in that trade-off. So for example, along with us being in the bottom 5 of women's economic freedom, India also has the great privilege of being in bottom 5 when it comes to men helping in housework. We are with Pakistan, Syria, South Korea, like these are the 5 countries. So I think the one thing is women actually, I feel, it's fine if we talk about things and feminism on Twitter and all of that, but I think in our own homes, if we force young men to start to do simple things like make your roti or like clean your dishes or simple things, just start with that, I think you will see it will all amount. It's intimate and it's incremental. It will amount to a lot of change. And you see this in Scandinavian countries, for example, right? Like you've seen a very long history. So that's one. Now the second thing is, if I don't wear a technical hat and if I think of it somewhat sociologically, we are very afraid of independent women. We are a country, and it's not just true of India. I think there's something, anthropologists call it the classical patriarchy belt. It runs through the north, it moves into areas of Pakistan, parts of Afghanistan, it sort of moves further up. These are areas where there's this shame and honor culture, and honor is very much tied up to the way women hold their bodies, the way women carry themselves. It is just sadly the way it is. I think it's very different in the south, it is different in the east, although if you look now, Kerala and Rajasthan's employment rate is the same for women. So, so much for people saying with the north and all of these things, it's now increasingly converging. It's only parts of northeast India where you see very high female employment rates, and divorced women, you see very high female employment rates because you have to work to support yourself. So we do have this script, but my sense is, I think that the shift will come when it's a mix, right? Not just activism outside, but I think activism in our personal lives. Calling people out when they do things not to support women. Encouraging boys to support women when it comes to their ambitions. Socializing boys and girls to say that it's okay, maybe a boy wants to stay at home and not want to go out. It's, this is not a male-female thing. I don't want to frame it like that.
I think it's just the movie stuff now.
Yeah, and
stays home.
Yeah, and in fact, this is the thing, which is that I actually feel that, for example, seeing in culture those kinds of signals, and in your personal life, practicing that. I really believe, I hate this kind of conversation on social change, which is that hum bahar jayenge and like there is a morcha and that will change things. Yeah, we never privately practice what we publicly tweet, right? Like everybody's saying these things, and in the book you really get a sense of the gap in that, and bridging that gap takes a long time. And I think that's where my faith is, and I think that's where the gender gap will also start to minimize. And then of course the third is I am an advocate of affirmative action for women. I think across the board when it comes to any reservation, if you're thinking of reservation, it should only be for women. There are studies that show that it actually works very well. If you don't signal to families that there are jobs for women, they will not invest in those, they're just not going to put in the effort. And I think this is where government policy can come in, but I really must comment that the private sector has tried. It has tried to redress these gaps. It's difficult because of the nature of motherhood, because of these scripts. And I think that only all of us can solve in our own homes. But thanks. I know it was a long answer to a very pointed question. Thank you so much.
I'm Rajiv Bogretta. It's a revelation for me that you mentioned that you have scanned through the data from way back from 1911 to the present times, and we find that the employment rate of the females has gone down. So that's the first revelation, and the type of jobs which the females are involved now as compared to the people who were there in 1911, are they different?
Yes. Yeah. So Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who I don't know, I think some of you may have heard her, she was one of our first freedom fighters. She had said sometime, I think in this was around the time of the freedom struggle, she basically said that when the machines come to make cloth, and I think I'm in a state where this has really been bared out, Rajasthan, Gujarat, you see this, it will just completely displace women economically because women were making a lot of garments at home. So if you look at the employment share in that 1911 till around 1931, the dominant share of women's work was in agriculture and was in garments. So khadi, cotton, cloth, anything within the home, textiles, embroidery, so on. The moment you see, I don't know how many of you have seen Rocket Boys, but there's this entire session about what Dr. Sarabhai had to deal with in Gujarat with this, which is that when you modernize mills, there are shifts in jobs and women's jobs change. If you look now, sir, where are women working? It is not the media. Everywhere I go, be it a village or some posh party in Lutyens, Delhi, people seem to think that all women are like on TV or in the media. They're not. It's like 0.0001%. It's really small. It's just very prominent because we see them, right? It's nursing, it's teaching, it's government services, because remember government services have made an effort, right, to try and hire more women. I think going back to that affirmative action idea. It's also banking amongst the sort of urban area. You see lots of women in banking. And it's retail and domestic work. So that's the one big now chunk that's coming up, which is paid domestic work within the home, care work, home-based work. But one thing I will say that hasn't changed is that largely the place of work for women is the home. And if you look at our labor laws right now, none of them acknowledge the fact that the home is a workplace. They're just yet to do it. In Gujarat, they've done it for BD workers and for agarbatti workers. I think in Rajasthan, there's something for textile workers, but you don't see it at the national level. I think that is really the need for the hour. Not that laws change very much, but once you have laws, what I have noticed is that women can organize to fight for rights, right? You use that to do something. So the home is the enduring characteristic, but I think the shift has been largely from garments to now these different sectors. Care has become now, I think, the main area, be it teaching, nursing.
Medicine?
Medicine is very small, sir. Nursing is still the largest chunk. Thank you.
Agriculture?
Thank you.
Agriculture has dropped significantly. Although, agriculture is a very funny thing, and I feel like all the statistics I'll just have to recite, but I'm not going to do that. Agriculture is a very funny thing. Agriculture has feminized. There are fewer men in agriculture because post the reforms of the 90s, you see this big migration out of men. They move now into construction and retail out of agriculture. So women have had to step in. But the whole pool of agricultural work has shrunk. So as a consequence, actually in the percentages, you don't see big shifts, if that makes sense. Partly automation, also just a lot of the shift to cash crops, the subsidy regime as such, it just changes the nature of where women are allocating their labor. But I think, obviously women are involved in agriculture, but I'll tell you a funny thing. A woman I follow in the book, she said this to me, she's from UP. She said in agriculture, everything that requires us to look up is a man's job. Everything that requires us to look down is a woman's job. So, going to the market, so on and so forth, a lot of that sits with men, and there is, of course, there is a feminization of agriculture happening, but you don't pick it up en masse in the instance.
Guy friends complain about it, ki she can do it, be their sister, their mother, because the pet. Women are used to it, but it's tough for me. They've got a taste of it. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Shalini. Not just for Indians, but like even women outside India. So I've had friends who, females who worked, got a job, but the moment they have their kids or family, after a period of time, the guilt kind of sets in, and then they start, feeling that, let me prioritize this, and then they let go of that ambition. So as a society, are Indians more emotionally, like that compared to the West, where women take a break, and then obviously there's a sabbatical, but they get back to it. But like Indians here, or is it more because they get more support from the men there compared to the men here?
So employment rates in other countries are higher than what we're seeing in India, and even with growth, low growth, you just see the stable move. I think there are a couple of reasons why. The nature of the state, so take the US for example, right? If you're a single mother, you get state support. In jobs, even for placement in the UK, women who are single women, for example, and single mother households get preference over other kinds of options. If you want to live on your own, or you want to sort of navigate a career, even with a partner, there are other forms of support that are available. For example, Scandinavia, as we know, has subsidized childcare. I mean, en masse, right? So you see these differences. Having said that, the gender pay gap still exists in other countries. I mean, it's not unique to India. It's a bit more acute here relative to other countries, but you see it. You also see women in leadership positions are lower than you would in many other areas. In fact, India has a funny thing, we have the highest share of pilots who are women, which is really not the case abroad, right? So there are these technical fields where women are doing very well in countries in the global south, which you don't see, but en masse, you have this challenge. My sense is it's largely because the private sector, but also the state is involved, particularly on childcare, care infrastructure, the welfare states of many of these countries, even where the welfare state is very small, like a country like the US, you still see the shift to try and support women be on their own. And also in a public space, access to that, supporting women. I don't want to sort of compare countries on support because that's it's difficult to quantify. What I can quantify is that currently Scandinavia, the US, the UK, Brazil, China, they all just have much higher female employment rates than men. One argument that is often put forth is that in India, a lot of women are socialized to say, well, a job is not really what you're supposed to do. That motherhood is your job. And maybe that's a script that is not as dominant in other countries, and it's shifted over a long period of time. Perhaps we're in the middle of that shift right now. So yeah, I think that's as much as I can say. But I hesitate to make a very strong claim because I have not, but I do know that those rates are higher, and I do see childcare investments are very different.
I'm a doctor. Yes. I've lived all my life working with nurses. Now, it's a fact that more males are coming into the nursing profession. Yeah. And yet you say the nurses is the main primary employment area for this. It is also changing from a particular specific area. For example, at one time Rajasthan had all the nurses from Kerala. Yes. Yes. And yet now, except for the Kerala girls who are married to Rajasthan, their issues may be, their children may be becoming nurses. Most of our nurses are now from Shekhawati. Yeah. Tell me now, what is the future of the nursing profession for the girls?
Sir, you should tell me about the future of the nursing profession. I can tell you about the future of Shah Rukh Khan or the employment rate, but I can't tell you. But I'll tell you something fascinating. Now you've explained so much to me. When I was here in Jaipur last time, there was a nursing exam going on, and I saw all these students out waiting to take that test. And you are right, I noticed that the gender composition was mixed. I don't know what the future of nursing is. I wouldn't know, but I do know the numbers tell us it still continues to be a very heavily female, feminized profession. It still continues to be so. I don't know about the granularities of the numbers in Rajasthan, but I do know en masse, if I look at the country, even if I look at the latest data coming out of COVID, In fact, women being in carer roles, not just nursing in the formal sense, but as you can imagine, home-based elderly care, patient follow-up, other kinds of ancillary services, lots of jobs now for women. In fact, a lot of people are saying, you remember I said that there was a sharp drop in female employment from 2004 to 2017. Little bit it's stabilized now, and a lot of people are saying it's because of the crisis, because COVID has necessitated, one, households are hurting, so women also now have to go out and work, and the second is a lot of these care jobs. And care continues to be a fairly feminine area of work. Some, like consulting firms will say, well, that's the pink economy and this is where the future of jobs are. The challenge with that, and you'll know this very well, is that even with that, there is still actually an enduring, when you look at the home-based care sector, a lot of ad hocness in the jobs, in the payment, agents, even the person who's being serviced is not happy, even the person who's doing the service is not happy. There has to be some regulation. I think this goes back to the earlier question this gentleman asked, which is that we really need to think about regulating some sectors for women, where women are present. In India, our employment policy is very funny when it comes to women. It's like we want women to be astronauts and pilots and in space centers, which is great. I'm all for that. But it's like we forget, where are the women actually working? So, why don't we look at teaching? The teachers are on strike constantly, we all know it. Why don't we think about home-based work? Why don't we think about garment and textiles? These are sectors where women are thriving and these jobs are not going anywhere. And yet a lot of the focus, and I understand, the focus is social. You want to sort of shift, women are not just in care, they're also in science, which is great. But surely we can't forget the sectors where women are very present. So my sense is the future of nursing for women is very positive in terms of a sector that will give them jobs. I'm looking hopefully to the government and the private sector to see what they can do about streamlining wages in some of those gaps.
I'll give you a short, brief answer to your question.
Yes.
The reason why, although men are going into nursing, the number of hospitals and institutions of care have gone up in such a large magnitude that despite all the men coming into the profession, there will be always shortage of staff and there will be enough jobs available for women who they want to do it.
Absolutely, provided we also have labor laws that allow them to work at night. I mean, there are all these issues about, this, the labor law regime right now. Rajasthan is actually one of the states that has tried to actually experiment with doing this somewhat differently. But labor laws also currently, in SEZs and other places where women work, it's almost like working for a benevolent dictator. You don't have any freedom, their phones are taken away. It's a very strange. Why would I, honestly, sometimes when I listen to these women describe their jobs, and you see it when you read the books, it doesn't surprise me that they just want to sit at home and watch Shah Rukh films and be a good mother and care there for their children, because the economy outside is it's horrid for women. And, sometimes I actually ask myself, maybe it'd be nice, just to opt out, but I can't, I have to support myself. But I think it is actually the nature of the economy, and I think some of those arrangements have to really be rethought through, and I think it's the private sector's imperative here. And I have hope, because I see a lot of corporate leadership and a lot of it is women, and they're very dynamic women. So hopefully things will change. But thank you for your question, and I'll keep what you said in mind. Thank you so much.
Hi, good evening. My name is Uma, and the question that I have for you is, does caste have any role to play with when it comes to women's unemployment? Does caste have any role to play when it comes to women's unemployment? I know it's sort of an obvious question, but I studied sociology back in my undergraduation, and one of the sociologists that we really look up to happens to be M.N. Shrayana. And he coined this term called Sanskritization.
It's in the book.
Yeah. And he said that as a community tries to emulate the qualities of an upper caste community, one of the things that they adopt is trying to put more conservative rules and regulations upon their women. The reason I'm asking you this question is because his texts were written back in 50s and 60s. Does it still hold some truth today?
Yeah, so you asked me about caste, right?
Yeah.
She heard caste. She heard caste. So we were very confused for a second. We were thinking, are we issues? I don't know. And then when she said M.N. Srinivasan, I said, no, she's talking about caste.
I'm so sorry, I have a list.
No, I would like you to know, I heard caste and she heard caste. So that said something about
it was like a witty question. I was like, Okay.
I'm going to give Tamanna a hard time about this later. But yes, in fact, there's a section in the book where I outline, as I mentioned, like the 5 families of reasons we see this sharp drop in women's employment. Sanskritization is one of them. Economists call the Sanskritization, because economists will have more, politically neutral terms. I think that's the way to put it. So we call it the income effect. What sociologists very nicely will call the Sanskritization effect, we will call the income effect, and it's exactly the same thing. But the other thing I actually want to say to you about caste, which is really, really critical, and you'll see it, it's laced, it's through the book. And the book, you won't be surprised, the book is structured around people where they are placed in the income spectrum. So the first half is people like me, and typically wealth correlates with caste in India, right? So it's upper caste, people who are the first part, and it keeps moving sort of down the chain in a way. What's fascinating to me is that caste is such a significant reason. You heard what she said, right? Who will let a Banya girl marry a boy from the south? It is such this fear, what will the girl, and going back to what Durga was saying, what will the girl do with herself if she's at an office and she's meeting people who are, what is the big fear about women's autonomy? The biggest fear in a caste-based society of women's autonomy is that you're going to then end up procreating with people who are outside caste norms, right? Like that's what's going on. There's such fright. People are so frightened that is not just men, it's women, mothers, so on. You'll see it in the book. Even the mention of Shahrukh, there's actually a father in the book who keeps checking on the daughter's room because he's worried that she's like cutting tape, taking posters and doing things, and he's very uncomfortable because what is fandom to him, it is also signaling his daughter's sexuality. It is saying that, when someone says someone thinks Shah Rukh Khan is attractive, it's very banal, but what does it actually mean? It also means if you think someone is attractive, you wouldn't mind exploring something with a person like this. It frightens people who are very worried about that script of purity, right? Like feminine sexual purity. Frightens them tremendously. And then the frightening comes out in different ways, which are quite comic also at times. So yes, it's definitely a factor, it's not going away anywhere, and I think we only need to look at I think what's changed though is I think there's a big shift among sort of what we would call OBC communities, and you see it in the book. I think that's where there's a lot of churn happening because incomes have gone up, access to Western media has gone up, so there's this big shift about what are women's roles and what they're supposed to do. But at the back of the table is actually a table by caste, female employment rates, and they stay very stable. It's tribal women who are working the highest rates in India when it comes to employment rates. Upper caste women, you see the lowest. So you see that very strong correlation. Thanks for the question. And if SAS does, I really want to retire SAS. I think we should talk about caste and retire SAS. Like, I think SAS is supportive, but caste is like a serious problem.
SAS is a serious problem.
Hi Shrayana, thank you for your time and being very generous with your thoughts. I really appreciated it. My name is Rahul, Nanta Suna Yoga. That's the closest I could get to shower. Cheesy as a kid. But I'll do a bit of a quick share based on the last question and then a quick question for you. I've got no representation here. I just watched a movie, I'll just share with you, which is called Writing with Fire. Please watch it. It's, if you have, that's great. It's about Dalit women running a newspaper. True docu-movie over about 8 years. Please watch it. It's really empowering, and it's a lady director who's directed it just fantastic. So please do speak to that. Question for you. Over the last 5 years, 6 years that you've been 15 that you've been writing the book?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Any silver linings in the stats that you could talk about that give us hope? That's it, really.
Yeah, thanks. A couple of things. Mobile phones, access to media. There are gaps between men and women, but you see the rates are increasing. And what we know is that the moment women, the Shah Rukh metaphor is very useful because what is it saying? It's saying the moment you have access to images that are outside of your realm, it does something to your imagination and your expectations. The frontier of your possibilities change, right? All these girls have seen Shah Rukh when they were very young, play out these idioms of a man being in London, and I actually say none of them, in the end, none of them want to marry him, they want to be him, they want his success, they want to be in a city, they want to do what they want to do, they want to be loved and adored for who they are. And you see this access to media and just simple images and information really starts to change gender norms so deeply. And I think the book is actually a testament to that, which is the reforms of the 1990s and what I think that government did and all the telecom reforms that have happened after, because images have now just become more accessible. I actually think that's one silver lining, so that's one. In the data when it comes to employment, things are not great. What is actually very good to know though is that when women are postgraduate educated, they will always hold on to a job. It is like a very strong correlate. Postgraduate education, marriage and motherhood has an issue, but what you see is that women try and come back. So that's the second. So I think that's the second silver lining. And the third silver lining, I want to give you the example of gold, is that where the private sector really says, you know what, we're going to try and make an effort to really train, recruit, mentor women. It helps. You see aviation. At a point of time, in-flight attendants in India were fighting for their rights to actually gain an extra pound and work beyond the age of 35. This is a seminal labor case in India. Yeah. Now, in fact, there's pay parity. You talk to anyone, you go on a Vistara flight or an Indigo flight, you talk to the women who work on those flights, they're quite happy with the way they're being treated. No one is like measuring. They are thriving, they're doing well, they're moving up the chain, they become, you know, they assume positions of leadership as well within those roles. So I think those are the three silver lines to me, which is media, access to information. I think the fact that postgraduate education really seems to, you know, ensure women enter the channel to jobs. And I think the third would be the fact that where the private sector really makes an effort, things work.
I think maybe the book itself can be a silver lining, right? Like if she's put it on paper and all of us can read it and talk about it, so maybe that will also kind of ignite some sort of change for sure.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. Anyway, I have other thoughts I won't say, I'll say it after.
Not public, to keep it PG-13.
Yeah, good evening. Is there a study on why the societal structure is breaking up in the West, and any study on that?
I'm sure there is. That's not my area of study, but there are. I think when you mean breaking up, could you explain what you mean? I mean, do you just mean that I can't see the gentleman, sir?
I was curious to know if two independent working, if a couple, both of them are independent, does that lead to the breaking up of the societal structure?
No, I mean, look.
Especially in the West.
Yeah, look, I think you could look at it two ways, right? The more conservative way to look at it is, well, because everyone is so individualistic, you just prioritize your own desires, and if you're unhappy with something, you walk away. That's one way to read it. I would read it a very different way, which is to say that I don't think any of us should endure relationships where we're not growing or are not happy. Especially when the breaking up of those relationships may actually lead to, use an economist term, Pareto improving. Like it may actually improve welfare for your own psychological well-being, children, all that other stuff. There are, various ways of seeing that. I think then in that way, why would you endure being in... So I think it's both, it plays in both ways.
I think he needs the mic.
What I was getting at is, I'm sorry I missed the point, the impact on the children, the socialization of the children.
Yeah, but what about that? I mean, do you think it's necessary for people to stay together for the kids to be well adjusted? Do you really believe that? There's no data that shows that.
Your take on that?
Forget my take. There's no data that bears that out. I mean, there's nothing. I mean, this is like a script that we keep telling people so that they'll keep holding on to things that don't work for them. I think it's very different for every unit. I'm not going to sort of advise anyone what they should do. That's up to them because everyone's relationship is unique. I mean, who am I to say anything or have a take? But what the data does show is that kids who grow up in violent, unhappy, complicated scenarios where they see women in particular repressing their desires and their expectations, those kids are not well adjusted. I mean, you only have to look at psychological research. There's stuff coming out of NIMHANS that shows that for India as well as for other countries. And the other thing I will say is that I think familial stability there's a very heavy price to pay for familial stability on children if you don't have open conversations about what's happening in that dynamic. And all the data tells us that boys who see their mothers, and it doesn't have to be a job, it could even be politics or community work, just stepping outside the home, those boys grow up to have always more liberal values about supporting women in their own lives. The studies out of Harvard Business School, which are about the US, that show that. There's stuff that's going on in India now that's showing this as well. It certainly bears out in the book. So I think we should retire this idea that we should just hold on to something just because of the children. I think it's very different, sir, depending on where you are, and sometimes it might actually be helpful for the kids not to grow up in repressed environments, because we do have a culture right now of a lot of boys who I think are growing up in very repressed families.
Yes. Also, sir, if I may add a bit to that, I think maybe you're saying the West, because I think women there, if they do have the financial independence, then they have the choice to walk away from a partnership, and Shrayana mentions it in her book as well. That if things, I think one character says that I have nowhere to go. So I've considered myself, I made myself single in a relationship. So I think in India that happens a lot, right? Yeah. Women are just with their partner or husband.
Yeah, no, Meeta's giving us the glare of like, stop it. I just want to, there's one of my favorite sub-stories I wrote. She's called a Rajput philosopher in the book. She's a woman who comes from a Rajput family, married against her wishes, has 2 boys that she absolutely adores, doesn't have a particularly loving relationship with her husband, and it's really remarkable how she's able to, she can't walk out of the marriage. It's not a possibility, it's not even something she will entertain, and you should just read the book to get a sense of, for the sake of the children, for their happiness. So that actually, this is one example of what you were saying, right, that she felt for the kids she wants stability. But it's not stability which is emotional or psychological, it's actually material. Because if she leaves, her parents, I mean, there will be too much of a backlash. And so she navigates one way or the other. So it's very complex. I think it's different for different people.
So the questions that you have that are still pending in your hearts and minds, when you're getting your book signed from Shrayana, you can. Yeah, but keep them brief. Bichari thak jayegi bolne. I'd like to request Dr. Shrayana Bhattacharya to please come up and give a token of appreciation to our author and our moderator. By the way, the doctor is also an aspiring writer.
Thank you.
I really wanted to add a lot to that conversation, but I had to just fight back. That's one of the things that we have to do when we are just holding forth. But thank you so much, Shrayana, for all the energy and the way you gave of yourself to everyone. I'm sure we really, we're all going back home with a lot of thoughts in our head, and I think we all need to really change our vocabulary to start with. You know, the way we look at our social conditioning and the way we move and navigate the space, especially when it comes to women working. I had a lot to say about the last comment, by the way. Thank you so much, Tamanna. That was skillfully, very deftly moderated. You have a proud husband in the audience. And thanks everyone for showing up. There's one book per family. So everyone knows the drill. But till next month. Thanks again for coming. And listen, can you all just give me a little more energy, please? This is just not fair.